Hi, I'm Saul Davies. I've spent the last 30 years being a musician in the band James, pretty much playing kind of everything. Probably I would be described as a multi-instrumentalist, but mainly guitar and violin, drums and stuff. So that's what I do. Um, that's me. So my links to Stirling and the kind of area of Stirling and Stirlingshire in general go way back to early part of my life. Actually, I was born in Liverpool, and we moved around a little bit in the north of England, and finally moved over the border into Scotland in 1974, and initially to Paisley, actually, and then moved into the Stirling area. Both my parents, by then they had 4 boys, and both of them went to Stirling University to study at the uni in the mid-70s. And so, of course, we lived, around Stirling, and I ended up going to school in Kippen and in Thornhill, and latterly in Callendar, actually. Then later on in life, after moving away, I came back to the Stirling area, lived in Dollar for a while, and Stirling itself, actually, for a while with my family. So it's an area which I know physically very well. I have great memories from my time spent in Stirling, growing up, as I say, and also as an adult. And I love that part of the world, and I have a very strong affinity for it. The scenery of the place, the feel of the place, and the people there as well. Some of my dearest and closest friends are still there, and I'm often in touch with them, and I often find myself in Stirling. So it's a special place for me, and for my kids also, who have been schooled there. My son Vincent for a while, was at school, at secondary school, in Stirling. So it has a huge attachment for me and my family into the area. Actually, I was at the primary school in Kippen, and uh, most people seeing this will know where Kippen is, and it's a little village just kind of into the hills, into the Garganic Hills. Actually, we lived quite remotely above the village, in the mountains as such, really. There's a crazy little road which has got some gates on it, which prevents livestock from escaping too far away from where they're supposed to be. And we lived on a farm up there called the Garrick, at the time owned by a mad, quite pompous but fabulous, aging English aristocratic company called the Rutledges. They were mad as frogs, and suddenly had this rather strange family of kind of wild kids and kind of hippie parents living on their farm. Anyway, and I went to school in Kippen, and it was in Kippen that I remember very clearly someone coming into the classroom and saying, I always hated maths. I was rubbish. I'm still rubbish at maths. Pride myself almost on my inability to deal with anything mathematical. And someone came into the class and said, who would like to miss one maths lesson a week? And kind of everybody's hands went up. I remember this very clear. It was very funny. And then the person said, okay, and who would like to take up the violin and spend that hour doing violin lessons? And everybody's hands went down as they realized this was a trick, apart from mine. And I thought this was a great wheeze. So it was at the age of 8 that I started having lessons on the violin. And I didn't have a violin, and I'd had no interest in playing. Our house was full of music growing up. My parents were quite adventurous in the records that they brought into the house. And we even way back then had imports coming from America, vinyl records coming from the States, being delivered every few weeks, some weird record, Little Feat or Tom Waits records would turn up later. That was the Tom Waits records would turn up by post, and our postie would come in and listen to them with my parents. It was pretty funny. thought, why not play violin? How bad can it be? Well, it was pretty dreadful, actually. Yeah, so that's where my music education started. And I think also it's interesting and instructive to note that, I benefited there from being given the opportunity to have free lessons. So there was no payment for the lessons, and I was given a violin, and that allowed me just to play. And obviously that system is not in place any longer, and I think it's a shame that we don't find a way economically. Our governments don't find a way to be able to give these resources to people coming through, because it is access to those instruments and access to expertise in the form of lessons that allows another generation of people to play, regardless of their economic standing. And that's the point. My parents were, as I said, they were students, and we really didn't have two beans to rub together. There's no way I would have been able to afford to buy a violin and pay for lessons back then. So the path from having lessons, kind of scraping away in the evenings at home, to actually being able to play the violin is pretty torturous. And I do recommend it to people, but I recommend it as a solitary activity away from other people, perhaps. But actually what happened was I discovered that I was quite good at it, and the teaching might have been really good, I suppose. I mean, it was so long ago now, I don't quite remember, but I'm sure it was great. And so I got quite quickly to the point where I was making a noise that other people enjoyed and liked. So actually, by the time I was 13, I was the leader of the Stirling Youth Symphony Orchestra. And obviously my teaching had been around classical music, like learning physically and technically how to play the instrument, and also to express yourself to some extent, but not necessarily express yourself in a way that, I subsequently went on to do. I have very fond memories of it. I remember, when you were the lead of the orchestra, you have to wear a tailed jacket. I don't know if you still need to do that, but we did in those days. And it's pretty funny, really, because I was quite small. I also had very long hair, which made me slightly odd and unusual, I suppose, to some extent. Being around all of these big, near shaven-headed, strapping kind of farmer types. And I do remember that my parents somehow, from somewhere, and it will have been from a second-hand shop, got me a tailed jacket, because you're supposed to wear a tailed coat, but it was far too long. So I remember walking on the stage. I do remember this, to play this. I was so nervous, as you would be, you imagine, kind of nearly tripping over the tails on my second-hand jacket. Sounds a bit pathetic in a way, but of course, when you're 13, there's a mixture of excitement and fear that get you through these kinds of events, and you just want to play. You just want to do the thing, and you want to do as well as you possibly can. So that's quite a moment for me, really, and is a, and I suppose from people around me, it would have also been the case that they thought, oh well, this kid can do this, actually. So I suppose from that age, 13, 14, 15, when I was 16, we moved, we ended up in the Highlands. We went to the Black Isle and I went to school in Fortrose then, Fortrose Academy, and continued my music alongside all the other things that we were doing. But it was in the Black Isle that I started hearing folk music and started thinking about the violin, not only as a classical instrument, but also as a folk instrument, which was great. We then moved back down to Calendar for a while, and I ended up back at McLaren High School, where I continued those lessons and all the rest of it. But then we moved to England. We moved to Hull. My parents separated at that point, and I pretty much found myself on my own for a while. I was 16, 17 by this time. So it was in Hull that I started meeting a lot of other musicians. So I joined the Hull Youth Symphony Orchestra, actually where I met Adrian Oxall, who was the lead cellist and who was a brilliant musician. And he, at that point, we had no money. We were at school, we were studying for our A-levels, as you have in England, all the rest of it. but we had no money, and we were becoming aware that having money was a good thing because you can do things if you have money. So we actually, my mother said to me, you and Adrian need to stop talking about things and actually do it. So she booked us. It's very cool. She booked us a gig playing in a French restaurant in the middle of Hull, a restaurant that was owned by her friend, for a month's time. And she said, right, you've got a month. You need to get it together in a month. So in that month, Adrian said, right, I'm going to teach you to play guitar. So by then I was learning the drums. I became obsessed actually by drums, and had joined a band in my school, Henry Cooper High School. I used to disappear into the green room and play drums a lot. I was self-taught and found that I was very good at it. I could do it. It was something I really enjoyed doing. And joined a band in the school. We only played jam songs. So we called ourselves the Jam, obviously. And in our minds, we were the Jam. Better, probably, even than the Jam. And we did a gig one lunchtime, and my dad came along to watch it, and he was kind of amazed. He was like, because he didn't know I'd been playing the drums, because I'd been playing them only at school. We didn't have a drum kit at home, and he was cajoled by all my friends and teachers, and we buy him a drum kit. So I got a drum kit. So that was the drums coming into my life. And Adrian in the background was teaching me guitar. So suddenly we were armed with the ability to be able to do stuff, and we started playing live. It was amazing. We did one gig, and we were in the garden of our friend. And we were raided by the police and told in no uncertain terms to shut up. And we were disturbing people. We modelled ourselves by this time on the Doors, which we thought was great fun. And actually, I think we were probably pretty dreadful, but it was all part of this kind of learning curve. We were rehearsing and playing and writing in my house, where I was with my dad in the kitchen, which was a tiny space. But it brought a lot of integrity to our playing. We could really, in a tiny space, we've almost got no space to physically move about, and you're playing, you're on top of each other, and it was great. So so my relationship with Adrian, this is significant because going into the 90s, when Larry left James, Larry being one of the original members of James when he left, it was Adrian that replaced him in James. In fact, he's there now again. So our story goes full circle through him teaching me to play guitar, and then in the end, me bringing him into my band, into James. So, which is kind of cool. But I suppose going into the 80s, so I went to university in Manchester. I went there to study law and didn't really enjoy that very much, so I left, and then had a while away, and then came back, studied archaeology. And the thing is that, so this was Manchester now by kind of 84, 85, 86, that kind of period going through. And of course, this was an amazing hotbed of music, you can imagine. Manchester was rough, but unbelievably creative as a city, with all sorts of bands. Factory Records was banging out all of these amazing records by Geruti Column and Railway Children and all sorts of people. And then around that, you could go to the Cypress Tavern and just watch new bands. Like, I saw people in there, like A Certain Ratio, Joy Division. You didn't think anything of just wandering in to like the Cypress Tavern and just going, oh, who's on tonight? Oh, A Certain Ratio on, whatever. Oh, there's somebody called Joy Division on, whatever. It was amazing, really. And then getting through to 88, 89, by then I'd stopped studying, but I was there. And the Hacienda was in full swing. So the Mondays were happening, and when I joined, so it was at that point that I joined James, by mistake, really. I used to go a lot to a place called Band on the Wall, which had music on 6 nights of the week, different genres of music every night. I used to go there a lot on Friday nights because it was reggae, and I was really into kind of roots reggae, real reggae. And Band on the Wall was a magnet for lots of great bands from Birmingham and Wolverhampton, the Midlands, where there was a huge West Indian community, obviously, and a lot of great reggae music. Bands like Steel Pulse, who are kind of, in my estimation, totally underrated. So we used to go and watch this incredible music in Band on the Wall. And one night, having moved away from Manchester at that point, but gone back for an evening just to say hello to people, there was a band on the stage doing a kind of a jam night or whatever. And my girlfriend had put my violin in the back of her car, unbeknownst to me, and she said, "Go and get your violin, it's in the car, and you can go and join the band," because they were asking people in the audience to join them. And I was like, "No, I'm not doing that. Anyway, I did. And a little bit annoyed by the whole thing, really. I got on stage and put a microphone onto the violin and just played one note, and trying to put people off. But I came off the stage, and it's mad, really. 9 people. I remember it very clearly because I could feel there was a bit of a buzz in the room, and all these people approached me and said, "Do you want to be in a band? Do you want to be in a band? Do you want to be in a band? All right, mate. Do you want to be in a band?" And I was like, "No, I don't want to be in a band. I'm fine. Don't want to be in a band." But anyway, one of the people who came up to me was Larry Gott, who was the original member, I mentioned him a few minutes ago, of James, an amazing guitar player and a very wonderful man. And he said, "Listen, forget everything else. We're actually a real band, and so come and join us, have a play with us." So I did the next day, and I didn't know of James at that point, but anyway, that was my first introduction to those guys. And so 3rd of March 1989, I was a member of James, and within 10 days we were on tour, which was a baptism of fire. Suddenly I had to learn a whole set. I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, what do I do? So just kind of walking around the stage, picking up various instruments, just playing them, whatever. And it was amazing. Tim and Jim and Larry, their attitude was just do whatever you want, really. It doesn't really matter. Just make a noise. How bad can it be? And so that was our first tour. And I remember it was interesting because we played at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, and it was full. It was now the Free Trade Hall is a hotel. Imagine we're so quick in the United Kingdom to sell off our cultural assets. It's pathetic. Free Trade, Dylan had played at the Free Trade Hall, Zeppelin had played at the Free Trade Hall, and we make it into a hotel, which is just so short-sighted, really. Anyway, we played that gig. It was full, and I suddenly realised, whoa, this band really means something to people here, especially in Manchester. It was amazing, really. And I remember my friend Adam had come to the gig, and I was like, I wonder where Adam is. And I came out the dressing room. I'd never been in a dressing room really before. Do you know what I mean? All of this was new to me. And there was Adam. He was sitting with Morrissey doing the crossword, the Guardian crossword. It was really funny. And I thought, wow, this is really something. Actually, I'll go back one record to another album that we made. The one that we made before Girl at the End of the World was called Lumpy Timor. And we wrote a lot of that record in the Highlands of Scotland. Jimmy had a property in Gairloch and on the west coast, far north on the west coast. And we used his home as it was at that point as a place for us to write, and it was really interesting because it was winter time and it was pretty freezing at that point outside, so we didn't go outside a lot. And anyway, we had to work, so we stayed cuddled up inside and wrote that record there. And for me, whenever I hear that record or play that record, I think of that place. And similarly, when we then worked in Stirling at Tolbooth, which was a real highlight for me, over the last since James reformed in 2007 through to now. That period of time that we had working in Tolbooth, writing at one point, and subsequently also rehearsing for a tour that we then did on the back of the recording of that record. I loved it actually, because it was an opportunity for me also to kind of show off to some extent where I'm from and where I feel very attached to. And the people at Tolbooth also were remarkably kind of welcoming to us, and we were made to feel really part of the whole thing. It was great, and we did really, really good work there. We made a great record in the end. And I think it is informed to some extent by the place and the time, and where our collect. You know, I always think that records, I think probably all art, one way or another, regardless of what it is that you're doing, is a snapshot to some extent of where the individual, if it's an individual event, or the collective is at. You know, and one thing that we try to do with our records is we try to define, you know, a record as an individual, as a separate, you know, separate from what has gone before. We try to find new ways to express ourselves. Certainly in the writing we do. At that point, we were working with a producer, a great producer, a German producer called Max Dingle, and he'd made Lumpy Timor, and then he also recorded A Girl at the End of the World. And whilst there is a similarity to some extent in some of the sounds that we use, there's also a difference, obviously. Time tells that story to some extent. The writing process for us is quite an intense experience, because we're four of us get together in a room and we make a noise, we record it. So we're jamming, we're improvising. We're not going into the space with any kind of pre-formed ideas. So it is an intense experience. Actually, it's an experience that we have recently gone through. Well, the back end of last year. Again, we rented a house back up in the Highlands on the West Coast, and we did a few days of writing for what will be our next record. Madly enough, it'll be our 16th studio album. The recording of that has been put slightly on hold, obviously, by events that are going on around us, but nevertheless, we've got the songs written, I think, now for that record. But it is interesting how the time and the place affects what you're doing, and the sound of what you're doing, and the way that you do it. It's when musicians get together in a room and make a noise together, it's a pretty magical experience. It can be frustrating as well, and sometimes you can feel like you've missed the point of why you're there. But some other times, magical things happen out of nothing. That's what improvisation is. You're looking to create new things where there was nothing. And so the Tolbooth became central to that for that record. And I can't listen to that record or play any of the songs from that record without being reminded of the time that we had, you know. And I guess we also did a show in there. Obviously, as you all know, it's a small space, so it was a very intimate affair. The show that we did as a thank you, partly to the Tolbooth for having had us there. And it's you know, I also had a special feel to it, and it's maybe a little bit out of the norm of the kind of thing that would go on, you know, to some extent. And but it was it was a good commitment, I think, from us also to the place. Of course, we were afforded an opportunity by Tolbooth that we would have been crazy not to take them up on. The building itself is very special. It's got an atmosphere to it, which we all love. Yeah, so we were very fortunate to be able to work there, I think. Maybe at some point we'll be able to go back and work there again, I don't know. But certainly, it also gave us that opportunity to play in front of that small number of people, and it's something that we really love to do. It is something that we don't often get to do, because it's demanded of us when you get to a certain level as a band, in terms of how, the potential public that you've got, it's kind of expensive to get onto a stage. And so, you're always pushed onto big stages. So pretty much, it's an endless frustration to me that it looks like we can only ever play in Scotland if we play at a big festival, or we play, at the Hydro in Glasgow or whatever. And it annoys the hell out of me that we can't go and play in, other places like Stirling, for example. But I think we might try and change that in the future and do a series of smaller, more intimate gigs that we can make work, economically, so that we don't lose money, at least, which would be great. But it's a good question, because we are all in our lives, artistically or not, our decisions are informed and affected by where we are and the culture that is around us. And that is certainly true, that A Girl at the End of the World, is very much a sum of its parts. And one of those big parts being where we wrote it. Yeah, I play loads of instruments, and I guess it partly depends on where we are and what we're doing as to which one I prefer to play the most. I mean, I love playing drums, and I love thinking of the drums as an instrument rather than just something that you smash and hit. Although smashing and hitting them is pretty good fun as well. When I listen to drums, I always enjoyed hearing people like Pick Withers, who made those first three very beautiful Dire Straits records, for example. And his playing, I always thought it was magical, the way that he played drums. And other bands which I love, like Floyd, the way he plays is technically not very well already. He's not a great drummer, but what he brought to the band is amazing. So I love hearing people play like that. But it depends what we're doing and where we are, or where I am. Even if I'm at home or whatever, like picking up a guitar and playing, messing around with sounds. The sonic possibilities of an electric guitar, for example, are endless. With pedals and effects units and all the rest of it, the way you play the guitar. And obviously, my first instrument, as well as the violin, I don't play it, that instrument so often in James. I like to keep it as something that I can play occasionally as a special. It adds a special flavour. I think those kinds of instruments which are outside of the norm, let's say, within a rock band or an indie band, or however you want to describe us, it's good when you use them sparingly, I think. And then they become more special. It alters the flavour of a song momentarily for a while if you put that instrument in. But it's a difficult instrument sometimes to make fit but which is why often the people that enjoy the way that I play the electric violin, they enjoy one aspect of it, I think, is the sonic nature of what I do. So I like to make big noises that are quite, they're sonic and sustained. So and I love to do it, and it's an amazing. Sometimes I surprise myself also, and I'm kind of like, wow, that was good, that was cool. So I don't have a favourite as such. It's what comes, Whoa, well, I'm not. Again, that's a really good question, and it's a really difficult question to answer. I don't know. I guess if I was closer to home, I would love to collaborate. Well, going back to actually the answer to the previous question, I mean, I would love to have the opportunity to bring some of those sonics that I do, for example, to Mogwai. Imagine, I'd love to spend some time with those guys making a bit of noise. And another artist who's similar in a way, although there are big differences also, would be Sigur Rós. Those kinds of bands are the things that I'm listening to a lot at the moment, in terms of bands which, okay, they have long careers, those bands, but they're still making records more recently also. Those bands where sonic elements are involved, that would be pretty cool. I'd love to collaborate with either of those. Just prior to meeting the James band in March '89, so I was being taught how to make pots. And a friend of a friend was a very brilliant ceramicist, and he needed help. So I went to his pottery and worked there for some months. It was after university was over, and I needed work and I needed money, and so I was working with this guy, Rupert Spira. His work is amazing. I was really fortunate to work with him. He's a very thoughtful character, so I was learning not only about how to make pots and deal with clay and all the rest of it, but I was also dealing to some extent with some, philosophy for life or whatever. But yada yada, doesn't really matter. I'm not sure I would have ended up doing that. I don't think I would. It's almost impossible to know where our lives would have taken us. Sometimes I think if I'd not walked into Band on the Wall that evening, or my girlfriend at the time had not put the violin without me knowing in her car, and I'd not got up on stage, and none of those events that then subsequently took place would ever have happened, of course, in my life. So it shows us that our lives are often, well, it looks to me like there are lots of chance encounters that we have that change the path and the direction of our lives. Some people think that actually those things are preordained. They might call it fate or whatever. I don't personally. I think that we never know what is going to happen. I've no idea what would have become of me. No idea. It's impossible to know. I would like to have been a footballer, but I was never good enough. I discuss this a lot with my kids. At the moment, I'm working with both my son and my daughter and my son's girlfriend on a musical project, working together, writing and recording and all the rest of it. And what I would say is you have to be brave. So if you try to fit in, you'll fail. You might do something good that you enjoy yourself, which is great. I mean, because you also have to ask yourself, what do I want to achieve? So, and there are different levels to this. So if you want to achieve a career in the music industry, that's tough. Almost nobody gets a career in the music industry. So it's very difficult. But there are ways to get there, They rely on luck, they rely on hard work, they rely on all sorts of things that, people either have or do not have in their armory or in their nature. If you want to play music because you think it's important in your own life or even in the lives of people around you to play music, to create things, music is an act of, making music is an act of creation. So if we think about it as being an expression of art rather than just like it's music, if you create a different context around the creation of the thing, then you also perhaps will open some other doors. But you have to be brave. So if you listen to records that were made in the 60s and the 70s, you hear a lot of very brave artists making mad records. And we've lost some of that, in my opinion. Certainly in mainstream pop music, we've lost that. There are other forms of music, even like in grime and some urban forms of music where people are really, they explore new sounds, new stuff, new structures, whatever. Actually, there's a lot of really interesting stuff being done in those musical forms. But generally speaking, I would say that people have a tendency, people who play guitars or pianos, whatever, and want to write a song, I think there's a tendency to think that we'll try to fit in. And I think fitting in is the wrong thing to do. You want to fit out. You want to get outside of the system and find your own voice. And even if you're knocking on the door from outside, maybe the door will open to you, The history of rock and roll is not determined by people who've tried to fit in my opinion. So my advice would be it is actually slightly counterintuitive, which is to be as difficult as you possibly can. And as honest as you possibly can about what it is that you want to say. So again, if you're a lyricist or a singer, is to try to find your own voice and not to mimic someone else. The tendency, we all do it. We all tend to mimic our heroes or whatever we think is the way that our culture is at the moment. But I think it's a huge mistake, because that way lies to stagnation of culture. You need to move forward. You need to do new things. There's a lot of vested interest in things staying the way that they are. So the business of music likes to control everything that goes on to an extent. But the role of the musician is to smash that down a little bit. And we're particularly good at it in Scotland, in Britain in general, but in Scotland especially. Think about this. The population of Scotland is 4.5 million people, and we are the 7th biggest exporter of popular music in the world. Now, and I mean, I include in that, Celtic music, folk music, traditional music, the trad scene, all the rest of it. But that's pretty remarkable. So when people talk glibly about Scotland punching against its weight, above its weight, we often think of that in terms of the whiskey industry or, whatever. And it's massively important, obviously, vital to the economy of Scotland. But actually, for me, where Scotland really punches above its weight is in music. And the history of rock and roll globally, the most, shot through with Scottish artists, going right back into the 60s. So we have a brilliant voice in Scotland of music, and a great attitude. And we need to recognise that. I would think that at the moment also it's a very good time to recognise this, because obviously, global events are overtaking all of us to some extent. And it leaves us all wondering where we will be in the future. And actually the music industry is very seriously under the cosh at the moment. But there will be ways out of it, and to some extent or another, the artistic integrity of Scotland may well come to be one of the ways that Scotland gets itself out of the situation that we're currently in, if we're allowed to do so. But Scotland's artistic voice through music, I think, is vital in the future of Scotland going forward politically. Also, and I would like to see Scottish government also support initiatives on the ground in Scotland that, in a real way, support Scottish musical culture, but not in a way that is looking back, but is actually looking forward. So my advice, though, to somebody starting out is just to keep doing it, keep playing, find people that you want to work with, do it on your own if you can't find anybody to work with. Don't listen to people like me. Just get on with it.